Good evening. You're listening live to the Xtreme Movie Show. I'm your host, Rob. Alongside me tonight, I have the young 20-something Professor Pixel with me. We're going over our special episode, Xtreme TV. Right now, we're covering The Prisoner, British spy TV series. It's everything James Bond is not. We're on season 1, episode 10, and a very infamous or famous episode, a very fantastic one on all sorts of levels called Hammer into Anvil, which Professor Pixel sometimes, it's one of those things where you either get to hit something or you get used to getting hit. And so it's just which one are you, A or B? And that's what this episode implores. And I'll start off by saying this. Well, we've talked about this particular season of The Prisoner, and the only one really. I think it's one of the best TV shows of all time, the way to explore stuff. It's not necessarily got a lot of high rewatchability unless you're going back and looking for certain things. But that being said, I think the writing is spot on, especially for late 60s, as it's introduced a lot of us to concepts that we take for granted today, like brainwashing, psychological conditioning, psychological driving, free will, which we don't really get a lot of in shows. That being said, I think the show's goes a little bit against the template of what we've talked about that we've seen in most episodes, because number 6 actually doesn't even try to escape. The order or sequence of which we're used to seeing different things happen in almost every episode, most of those occur here, but again, out of order. And there's a really bizarre thing in here that just totally undermines the rest of the episode, which we'll talk about as we get to the infamous Kosho fighting scene. So I'm going to try to keep it together until we get to that. But what's your initial take on this episode and where we're at so far?
Yeah, no, there's a lot about this episode that is different from the template, and I love that. There's just from the beginning, you know that there's something different about this episode, and as you go through, it's just great to see it unfold. And so I suppose the best way to talk about it is to go through it. This episode starts not actually with the prisoner, but with another prisoner, a woman by the numbered 73. And number 2 is interrogating her, trying to get information. And ultimately, he isn't able to get anything, so he becomes flustered, and she freaks out and starts screaming. So number 6, who happens to be passing by, rushes in and distracts them enough for her to get out of the bed and leap out the window to her death. And that seeing that, number 6 swears to make number 2 pay for this cruelty. And from then, number 2 lets 6 leave, but ultimately wants him to come to the dome. And, well, he interfered. And so because of that, he's going to try to make him pay.
Yeah, I think the woman trying to jump to her death is like pretty shocking, because it happens early on, and we see her jump through the window. We don't see the fall. We just see her laying there, but they cut between him hearing the scream and running. And one of the things about this episode that sticks out, I mentioned before, I really almost prefer some of the episodes where he's sneaking around the town, or not even sneaking, just walking around the broad daylight at different times, because to me, this is one of those few things where the actual village itself can be a character. The more you know about, the more you can gain command of your area that you're on, your sphere of influence, as you will. It makes it more interesting because it makes us more invested in, what can number 6 do in a situation like this? What has he learned before with the tides and trying to escape that maybe he might be able to implement in here? And we almost kind of see some of those things come into play a little bit later with what he chooses to do here. I must admit, though, that we've talked about how this show is not like James Bond, where even though a lot of women have been used on the show in a few different capacities, either as watchers, direct interests, known plants to us or not as a viewer, or to number 6, we know that he does not have relations with them. It's not that he's not a full-blooded British spy. It's just that they chose not to emphasize that in the show. And we've learned that most of the women on here cannot be trusted. Unfortunately, I was hoping that the number 2, who ended up being a woman in one of our episodes a few episodes ago, might have stayed, because the guy who's playing number 2 now, I think we've seen him one other time before, and this guy, I think, did a fantastic job acting in here, because we've said that most of the episodes have a different number two. Not all of them, but most of them. And we've also talked about the order might allude to different scenes coming up, like, well, oh, this doesn't make sense. It feels like an episode that should have been shown later or earlier. This one I got a sense because of how dark of an opening it is. It's like really dials us in, like, hey, this might be different. And also too, remember, one of his friends in one of the first episodes we saw and reviewed, supposedly jumped out the window to his death as well. And back, again, 50 years ago on television, that's kind of like a huge deal. So very kind of shocking way to get into it, but also makes it a little bit different too, is that we know that this guy's out for blood. And I was a little surprised that it affected number 6 so much that he wanted to make number 2 pay. It's like, I get it, I understand it. Well, why do you care? You're not emotionally invested in her. I know you don't like number 2. So I felt like that was empty or missing. It was just, we just assume that that's how it is. And we've seen him be physically sufficient in terms of fights and trying to run around and escape, but not particularly violent. And at least not bloodlustful like this. So we find out that what he's doing is just a way to escalate it, because he's going to have a different mode of attack in this episode on how he's going to try to influence things, eventually leading to his escape. Because at the hospital, like you say, he's like, I'm going to make you pay. And this guy looks like he could give two shits. He's got a great FU look on his face, and I kind of like it. I'm like, here's another real strong performance. So we see number 6 walking around on his own, because after being pissed, what's the best thing to do? Well, he knows he's being watched and followed. So he uses this to his advantage. He starts walking around to the outskirts of town, and then we get the goon squad and the golf cart coming up, where we get to see this really horrible fist fight, which for some reason I find these guys wearing these striped, horizontal striped sweaters, as they do in a lot of them, really garish. And I'm like, this is awful, but I loved it at the same time. But eventually they overwhelm him and bring him into number 6's dome office there, and they start talking, and they have a little back and forth about how it is. And actually, this is one of the first times we see generally number 2 physically try to intimidate number 6 by taking the sword, pointing it at his forehead, and saying, hey, are you afraid of me? You think you're strong? I'm gonna break you. And it goes right into you must be an anvil or a hammer. Which one are you? And he's like, I'm gonna be the hammer and you're gonna be the anvil. And so number 6 is like, okay, we'll see what's going on. And as soon as he leaves, number 6 gets on those stupid yellow phone and just says, hey, we're going to up the security on number 6 and see what's going on. And then that's when the show gets really, really super smart, despite the dark opening and goofy fight sequence here. What do you think about this?
Yeah, no, because with where we take a turn here, everything starts to come into play. I mean, number 2, he gets that famous line, precisely, I'm going to hammer you. Yes, but when number 6 hears that, he says, okay. And he starts going around the village, and he goes to the market. He gets a newspaper. He listens to a new set of discs, and he stops at a particular one and marks something down on the paper, leaves the paper and the discs behind. And number two, hearing this, starts digging through them, but they all sound the same. But clearly there must be something there. And number 6 goes throughout the day, the next couple days actually, and he has all of these plots, so it seems. And ultimately, I'm trying to remember which one was my favorite, because there's one in particular that really takes the cake here. But his main staff, number 2, his room full of people, he starts going up to people and he says, lovely weather we're having, don't you agree? Oh, yes. Just
yes,
took a stroll.
Yes, quite my good boy.
yeah. And the other person just stares at him mostly and gives little replies, but number 6 will lean in and he'll tell him, careful, we're being watched. And then he slips away. And number 2, hearing this, goes insane. Oh, really? This is what he's telling you? Really? You have nothing to hide? Oh, I don't believe that. Slowly but surely, uh, number 2 breaks down. He fires pretty much everyone in the village, including the vertically challenged individual, who doesn't even get a little number. But no, he fires him too. And all that's left eventually is number 2. And number 6, after his last man is kicked out, he goes there, and this is when number 2 is saying, "You're not actually a prisoner here. No, you're sent here to test me. This is all a game for me, isn't it?" And starts giving a little information, and 6 uses to its advantage, believing that he's from XO4, like 6 is supposed to know what that means. And ultimately, number 6 convinces him, you need to call your superiors, call yourself in, because he can't. He can't do anything there. And so he does. And when he does that, you can see a look on his face. And that number 2, I'm pretty sure, realizes in that moment that he was duped. He was hammered.
It's what's interesting with the shows. Like I said, we haven't seen this woman before, and it might have had some more emotional heft behind it if we had seen her in the background or saying hello to him, like in a previous episode or something. Not that there had to have been a relationship or even a brief conversation, but something like that, where it might have been like, "Oh yeah, I think I remember her," like the vertically challenged butler that we've seen more and more of lately, wearing black and white or having a black and white umbrella. That's going to come to play. It has to. But so when this young woman, 73, very beautiful young woman's in there, and she's completely freaked out and probably drugged up there. She's actually not there getting treatment. She had tried killing herself by slicing her wrists. And so, before she jumps out the window and does it, it's like, wow, this is a show where we're used to seeing how number 6 as an individual can exert his own agency and overcome outside forces. And unfortunately, the show does not deal with the toll necessarily that it takes on you, which what we see with her, because that's kind of jarring. And the reason why I mention that is because this whole hammer to anvil concept for the whole episode is very appropriate, because the one thing number 6 realizes is that, you know what, out of all the episodes where I've escaped and they brought me back, it's one of those things where, like, ha ha ha, you can't kill me because I have information that's valuable to you. It's not that he does that or flaunts it, but he knows that they have to treat him particularly, and that what they're doing is they're not necessarily escalating, say, drug treatment or mind control at this point yet. They're doing just different things, trying different methods to see what might break him down too. And if he didn't have such valuable information, maybe he might have been killed already. Who knows? But we've seen the psychic driving. We've seen everybody just gone from the village, and all these different things to get on mentally. So the beauty of this episode is that, knowing all this, number 6's plan is, to your point, as you described, going to try to break number 2 by turning the wheels on him, where he becomes the hammer and makes number 2 the anvil. And that should be pretty appropriate, as you said, the scenes where he's going over to, like, the 14 or whatever, or 13, and talking to him, like, and you're going, was he losing his mind? Is he whatever? What the hell is he up to? But it's pretty obvious, because we know you really can't trust anybody. And the other thing too is one of the episodes recently, I think it was the last one we talked about, where he actually was able to identify and recruit people to help him escape, and he figured out a way to do it. The chess episode, when he walks into the little gift shop that's near his place, there's a different person tending it, because the person that was in there who actually tried to help him wasn't there. I like that. And it's kind of cool, because immediately we see him listening to music, and he wants to listen to all 6 albums, make a note on something, hands it to him. And so there's all this little spice stuff going on. You're like, okay, he's fucking with him. This is kind of cool. And he knows that he's being watched. So we get an opportunity to see him walk around and follow people and watch people break into his own place to kind of see what's going on too. So he's a step ahead of everybody. He's the one initiating the acting rather than reacting. And I like this. It's more of the battle of wills rather than physically, can I remove myself from here? Because even if you do, you're not really confronting the issue head on of what you have to deal with, and that's why they want you and the information in your head. We'll see whether or not, of course, we get that. But there's some neat sneaking around scenes late at night, and we see how pissed off number two is trying to do them. And I love the night scenes here at the beach. I love them walking around. I love how when number two's looking at all the reports and all that, it's all this nursery rhyme kind of stuff like patty cake, and then the Morse code later on lights at the beach is something else entirely. It's nonsensical, but that's the point, because you can't have like meet me at dawn at 6 a.m. I've got information. It has to be coded, right? Which is something, and so it allows number two's own mental state, just how anxious he is to perform at his job, as much as he's starting to sit there and say, you know what? If you're really cocky and confident in your job, you don't try to overwhelm me or bully me. So he knows he's got the edge. He just has to exploit that. And so we see him doing that with these different things too. And you're right. It's a joy to kind of watch this too. It's getting to see a lot of the town and walking around, like I say, I think is great. The phone call he does is really neat too, where they're analyzing his vocal delivery to see if things are lying. And we see number two snapping at all the people who are supposed to help him. So it's like, yep, he's digging his own grave, and we see it. He even has to ask the band that we've seen that's all around town to perform and play the same place. It's really, really cool, and it's nice because you know what? This episode is not at all about number six. It's about number two, and this is where I said earlier I thought number two did a great job of being different than the other number twos. I can't remember if he was a number two in an early episode. I think he was. Just his face looks familiar, but it makes me go, yeah, the episode list that we've talked about, it's definitely probably could be reviewed in a different order, and some of them might make more sense. But that being said, it's going along really, really great. So much so that we get to a point where, is it 13 or 14? I think it's 13, right? The guy, the blonde-haired guy that we've seen, so that he's trying to put against number two. They get into a big kind of fight or whatever like that. Number two walks off in his office. It's number 14, actually.
Yeah.
And he goes up to him. He's like, you know what? You're a troublemaker. I'd like to beat the shit out of you. And number six is like, you know what? I know you're so pissed off at me, but he plays it cool because he knows he's got him. So he's not allowing it to agitate him. He's like, you would, wouldn't you? And he just says the one simple word that makes this whole episode just drown literally to absurdness is Kosho, which I think we've seen before. And what it is they're going to do a hand-to-hand battle where they can beat the shit out of each other and possibly drown somebody in a pool of water over over two trampolines. It's simply so stupid and absurd, and I'm like, what the fuck is going on here? Because we're starting off with suicides, we're starting off with paranoid conspiracy stuff. This is so whacked and bizarre, and it's only for like 10 seconds where he would almost kill the guy, and then he doesn't. He just saves 14 after the stupid jumping around. It is perhaps the lamest sequence I've seen out of everything. Not bad, not horrible, not, oh, I would have done this differently. It's just I'm watching this going, what the fuck? Am I high right now?
It's hilarious.
Absurd.
The small note, he was in a previous episode, but not as number two. He played Thorpe in Many Happy Returns. So
okay, that's the one episode I like. Yeah.
So with what you said about the kosher, yeah, no, that was definitely strange. But it also reminded me of the other the other trick, as it were, because number two later goes to the market and he picks up this cuckoo clock, and when he gets it, he goes ahead and he takes it home, and later he just drops it at number two's doorstep, and he sees it. He's like, oh my gosh, it's a bomb! Get it! Go! It's seeing him fall into insanity is so entertaining. And you're right. When this episode started, I thought we were getting another number two that was just, oh yes, look at me, I'm maniacal. No, here he is slowly sent into a spiral of desperation and a conspiracy that does not exist. The sad thing about this episode is that this information that we do get to learn is actually a whole lot of nothing. I don't think it's going to come into play at all, except maybe in the last episode. But the XO4, that's nothing for us, and it's probably going to stay that way. That's the only thing that really disparages me about this episode, because otherwise, holy crap, he actually got to learn something about the place. And that would show growth, but this show sadly does not have a sense of growth. It cuts itself back to the beginning as always, so that way anybody who's watching who sees an episode of The Prisoner, oh look, this is an episode of The Prisoner, I can watch it at any time. It doesn't matter what episode I see, it's all going to pretty much be the same, except this one, which has not him escaping, but him just toying with the one in charge of the village.
What'd you think of him? What'd you think of him uh, capturing a pigeon, putting the quote unquote secret message on the pigeon and sending it knowing that they would shoot it down and try to decipher it? So
Poor
silly.
pigeon.
Exactly.
But him doing that and then going to the beach and then just flashing pat a cake, and number 2 desperate, no, this must be a code. And it's just so you get to the point where you feel like, oh my gosh, put this man out of his misery. But it's in a good way. But now, with getting to the end, number 2 calls, lets his people know that he basically failed on number 6's orders. And he, like I said, he was the anvil here. And that alone made this one of the best episodes thus far.
It's the thing with the episode here, as talking about the end part of it, is we do see, of course, number 2 breaking down mentally, so much so that he says something, and the smart play by number 6 is just to let him do it, where he believes that number 6 was a plant, to test number 2, and it shows that this is obviously a fear-based type of power structure, if you want to look at it that. So trying to find out what he's dealing with is always interesting too, because at first, he wakes up, and we've talked about how incredible the opening is. Now it's pretty much the same opening, except for maybe some of the verbal stuff. We'll talk about that as we finish up the season, but it's like, okay, it's cool. And then we learn about the village and all this stuff. But when you get around to meat and potatoes of it, is somebody designed the idea of this village. It's been approved. If you look at the logistics of it mechanically, you have to have a certain amount of people that you can trust, your own staff, or people that have built it, and this and that. So while it might have been a secret location, this village made by certain people for this particular reason, finding out, those boundaries, as it were, whether it's the rover, which sadly, if he was in here, would make this the best episode of all time so far. We don't see him or it. We've seen the physical boundaries. We've seen dealing with some other people. So while he's tried to escape a lot of the times, I kind of wish, at least up to this point, there were more episodes dealing with something like this, where he's trying to figure out those boundaries, but the different types of boundaries, so he can formulate a plan. And that's what's refreshing about the episode, because as number 2 breaks down here, convinced that he's a plant, like I say, number 6 lets him think that or whatever, and he totally loses it. And the descent into madness, as it were, and we see it completely here at the end that yes, number 2, instead of being the hammer, is actually the anvil. So like that old expression, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and vice versa. So I just I like the fact that there's a music piece in here. I'd mentioned before in one of the earlier episodes, I liked some of the signs that I saw in the background, like music begin where words end, and you have something similar here too with him listening to it. It's I don't want to call it a goofy episode because of the Kosho scene, because that, if you take that out of here, or say it was fencing, let's say, it could have been a bit more dramatic. But the fact that this episode has some of the key things other than him escaping just done out of order, and it's about number 2 and not number 6, make it a lot more interesting because we've gotten into that habit of, okay, he's going to try to escape. We know not to trust women. We know he's not going to make it. How is he going to do it this time? And so we're just looking for what those differences are from what we've got accustomed to. So I think having an episode like this is really good. And one comment I'll make here about the final before handing it right back to you here is that when number 2 goes crazy and he goes to fire everybody, he's looking at the vertically challenged Butler and says, "Oh, like you're in this too, or whatever." And the Butler's just kind of like looking at him, and I'm going, it's kind of like if you're the president of the United States, no matter who you are, you have a doctor that services that station. So that's how some people choose to think of it. And I'm starting to feel like the fact that we've seen more and more of this vertically challenged Butler, that he's going to play a part, because why would they show him to us without him saying anything, really doing anything? He just seems to be around physically when things are at their worst between whoever the number 2 is at that time and number 6. It's starting to become readily apparent with that. But I do like how we realize that this is pretty much the end of the episode, except for number 14, whose life was saved by number 6 in the awful Kosho fight. um, he wants a piece of number 6's ass, so he just walks right into his place, and number 6 is chilling out, listening to the music from earlier, and they get into like perhaps the worst fist fight here, despite how many things they seem to roll over and knock over. It's by all takes to me a horrible fight, but I like it because it's weird and it's dumb and it's jazzy or whatever. But yeah, it's pretty much it. And then number 2 gets the call from the red phone, and after that we know it's over and end scene. There you go. How did this finish up for you?
Yeah, no. The end of this thus far is, I do think it is fantastic. My problems are, as I said before, it's information that gets us pretty much nowhere, most likely. Um, and it's hard to accept that, but that's simply the truth. But it's fantastic to see number 6 just actually get something for once out of this. And it's not all for naught. So that's what it has going for it. With the vertically challenged individual, as we call him, the Butler, he he'll probably be back right next episode. But as for him getting fired here, you can just see the look on his face as he does pack up and he does get out of there, and desperation. We can see it because there's ultimately no one left with number 2 trying to get to the end of the conspiracy, and it's really the first time it's been that sort of way where it's just the 2 of them. Obviously, there are multiple scenes where it's number 2 and number 6, but there's usually something else. There's usually someone watching right there, but not here. Here, I mean, number 6 probably could have killed number 2 and almost gotten away with it. That depends on if number 1 is actually watching out there. Who is number
Well, we
1?
assume there's a number 1,
Yes.
right?
Well, with the numbering system, there should be.
Well, it would presume that would be the case, but one of the things I wanted to mention too is I thought, because this is a bit of a different episode, I was trying to look up who wrote it, because a few people have written some of the same, or some people have written more than one episode. Some are one-offs, and Patrick McGowan himself was involved in a lot of the story stuff. And really, the length of this whole season 1 of The Prisoner should have only been about half as many episodes, because there's some that definitely seem like they're filler, and that's fine. But the guy who wrote this, Roger Wattis, he was, and I mention this only because I think it fits into one of the themes we talked about early in the first few episodes. He was openly a communist at the time. He's part of the Communist Party over there in Great Britain. Now, at that time in the late 60s, whatever form of communism that was popular that migrated over into Britain is maybe different than what exists here in 2020s in our world. Really not much so, I think, because communism is communism, otherwise it's something else. And so you definitely get a feeling sometimes when you talk about military or the way power structures are set up, how they affect people. And this would explain how you see number 2 in this episode kind of bitch out early on, because he's feeling all stressed out. Man, if I don't get this job done, I'm going to get whacked. and that's really kind of like a communist kind of thing. And it's, people can argue and fight about all that. That's really, I'm not bringing it up for that, but we did talk about how this shows put on display in normal TV themes that we hadn't seen a lot of before. Like I mentioned before, with the psychological stuff, there's definitely a lot of this whole totalitarianism type thing going on there. And as well, if you don't have that, then how are you going to have somebody try to get free? Because a lot of libertarians like the show because it's a person trying to exercise their free will, and whether they're successful or not, it's not necessarily the issue. It's that spirit of wanting to be free. And that's why I think, even though this is a British TV show and they put their own cheeky humor in it, like the Kosho fighting and stuff, I think it resonated with a lot of people over here in the United States, being allegedly the freest country on the planet too. And obviously the Youngstown with the culture that Britain has of Europe. But it's interesting because definitely a writer can add their own bits and themes to it. Because let's talk about this episode where, it's got poem stuff, it's got music stuff in it, it's got a certain cultural aesthetic to it that we have not actually gotten in other episodes. So that kind of makes it interesting to me too. So, like I say, it's a very entertaining episode to me. I think it's good because it's watchable, because all of a sudden from the get-go we know it's going to be a little bit different, and I liked it and I appreciate that too. So is it significant, at the end of the season for anything? I'm not sure, but it's definitely different because number 6 doesn't even try to escape. But overall, I enjoyed this episode. I thought it was pretty good too. We'd gotten kind of in the flow over the past few episodes. For all intents and purposes, seemed like they were about the same, but this one was different. Therefore, I pay attention to it. What's your final thoughts?
Well, with what you just told me about Roger Waters, maybe this shouldn't have been called Hammer into Anvil. Hammer into Sickle would have worked just fine.
Well, one takes it and one doesn't. So that's kind of the whole point. So I understand it's kind of a half joke what you're saying there, but those meant things back in the day. So anyway, it might be what was on his mind as well. But yeah, good stuff there, Prisoner. Season 1, episode 10, Hammer into Anvil. We'll be doing episode 11 next, so be looking forward to that. I'd like to, of course, thank everybody for watching and listening and getting the word out about the Xtreme Movie Show, which we do this as an extra stream for it. We'll recover some TV stuff, and of course, the young 20-something who's never seen some of this stuff at all, have heard about it, joining me on the watch for it. So I appreciate number picks coming up here and doing that with me too. Thank you, Chronaut. Good to hear from you here in chat there. I'm going to get ready to do the Goonies here, 7 p.m. Eastern Time live, so be checking out here. I'm going to rail on it. I'll be the minority report on that one because I'm not a fan of the Goonies at all. That being said, be seeing you. Have a good night. Batman, the animated series, has been discussed. I will say that. It's a question of timing and selection and who's going to be involved in it. There's so much to do. It's a question of priority. So I like that suggestion too. All right, guys, have a good night. Thanks for listening. As always, stay extreme.
Be seeing you.